Good morning. Excellent, a rousing response. I like that. It is a pleasure to be here. My special thanks to the Decorative Arts Trust for inviting me back to Charleston and to be present before you all. I'm particularly grateful to the Decorative Arts Trust because you have unwittingly supported various students of mine in the past, and I'll just highlight one. Catherine Doucette, my current PhD student, is working on 18th century decorative arts in Jamaica. She's done a ton of work working with both private collections as well as public collections in Kingston and elsewhere, as well as the V&A and private collections across London and England, and a few here in the United States as well. And so she is now working with me to finalize her dissertation, and so you should look forward to future work that really begins to center some of the decorative arts and material culture coming out of Jamaica in the 18th century. And thank you so much for getting her started. You all supported her when she was a wee master student. Okay, so let me just get started. We're going to dive right in. Here we go. The buildings now spanning 95 to 101 East Bay Street, part of a row of houses commonly called Rainbow Row, are the best surviving suite of Charleston merchant houses from the first half of the 18th century. Rebuilt soon after the fire of 1740, the largest house of the suite spans the double lot at 99 to 101, and that's the pink one here in this image. A single residence upstairs with substantial double parlors of the second floor overlooking Bay Street. The building was divided on the ground floor with two rentable shops, separated by an arched alleyway that gave access to the rear yard. You can see that. Built by merchant Othniel Beale, who emigrated from Marblehead, Massachusetts in the 1730s, the large house served as Beale's residence. Beale was a prominent merchant, but he invested also in real estate. Not only did he rent out the two shops on the ground floor of his own residence, but he also built, quote, a house and store adjoining to the south, and that's from his will, that further added to his rental income. So the kind of light green, well, I can't tell what the color it is, but this guy right here also clearly built as part of a larger complex. This house, this tenement, was offered for long-term or short-term lease. The consistency of the roofline and the cornice make clear that these buildings were built in a single campaign. And by the 1760s, Beale owned a wharf that extended into the harbor just opposite his house on Bay Street. And you can see that there's this little circle there. I've got little graphics that help you figure out what I'm talking about. Just to the south of Beale's property is the most visually striking building of this row, a townhouse also built in the 1740s with a footprint similar to Beale's rental house, but crowned by a spectacular curvilinear gable, and you can see that here at the top. Now listed as 95 East Bay Street, this house has a rear corner staircase that gave access to the upper residential spaces of the house, rising behind what was very likely another commercial shopfront opening onto Bay Street. These three buildings are a remarkable survival of a much larger and very complex landscape of mercantile enterprise that dominated the dynamic waterfront district of the city in its first season of explosive economic growth. This paper seeks to situate these three important survivals in a much broader historical context by drawing together a wide range of evidentiary types. Of course, surviving buildings matter enormously. But Charleston also has the great luck of having the Bishop Roberts watercolor view of the city's waterfront, now in the collections of CW. Painted in 1739, just 1 year before the Great Fire of 1740 destroyed much of the city. The Roberts view is an extraordinary repository of information about the architecture of the early city. In addition to his waterfront prospect, Roberts also produced an incredibly detailed and quite accurate iconography, or map, of the city in exactly the same year. But we also have a plethora of documentary information, ranging from the South Carolina Gazette, which began publication in the 1730s, and extensive land deeds and probate records, which I spent a great deal of time in yesterday. In her extraordinary book on 18th century Charleston, historian Emma Hart highlights the importance of the second quarter of the 18th century to the city's development. So that would be the 1725 to 1750. She notes that the 1730s was a decade of extraordinary economic growth, in part because by then Charlestown had become the major port used by captains sailing between the Caribbean and northerly British colonies. In fact, the closing years of the 1730s experienced the highest import value per capita of the entire century. Of course, the fire of 1740 stalled that growth for about a half decade. But the dampening effect of even that major destruction of the city was brief. Within just a few years, the majority of the city's merchants and traders were back on their feet. The extraordinary condition of commercial activity took place on wharves and in houses, stores, shops, lining the streets, lanes, and alleys, all clustered right at the waterfront. This paper will recover the buildings and spaces of that dynamic commercial city by recreating the now lost wharf district of the early 18th century and examining two major residential building forms, the townhouse and the tenement. We begin at the wharfs. North Adger's Wharf is today a quaint cobblestone lane flanked on both sides by 20th century housing. But its name and its orientation toward the water suggest that this space was once a very different kind of place. Originally called Eliot's Bridge, and bridge is a common 18th century term for wharf, this street was once a raised and narrowing finger of land jutting out into Charlestown Harbor. Constructed of masonry rubble and ship's ballast, and then edged with timber decking, these bridges, and you can actually see this particular bridge is it circle? Do I have it circled? I can't quite see if I've, it's, yeah, right here. No, sorry, it's this one right here. Yep. These bridges expanded in number through the 1720s to respond to the city's rapidly expanding mercantile activity. Seen on the 1739 iconography, and a portion of which you're seeing here, Eliot's Bridge sat near the middle of 8 such wharves that breached the water's edge through the first half of the 18th century and accommodated the huge number of incoming ships arriving from port cities around the Atlantic and the globe. Bay Street was marked through the early 18th century with a harbor wall that served to extend the defensive fortifications that surrounded the city. In a defensive posture against naval invasion, bastions, and you can see these at the far end of Bay Street, right? These two bastions, there's one there, and there's another one right here. These military bastions terminated each end of the harbor wall, and a half-moon battery stood in the center, a portion of which can still be seen in the cellar of the now Exchange building on that same location. At the head of each bridge, a break in the harbor wall allowed pedestrians to pass from Bay Street out onto the bridge. And so what we have to realize here is that East Bay Street actually had this large masonry wall that was the edge of Bay Street. So if you're walking down Bay Street, you've got a wall on your left side towards the harbor, and then you've got all these houses on the right-hand side. It actually felt like a channel, right? Very different from how we might experience it today. And careful inspection of the Roberts view reveals that the artist rendered those breaks in the harbor wall, even as he eliminated the bridges and their waterfront buildings to offer a clearer view. Stepping onto Eliot's Bridge, and I'll remind us again, Eliot's Bridge is this one right here, right? Which is just opposite the Othniel Build houses that I was showing you. Stepping onto Eliot's Bridge, any person would notice the long, narrow buildings that framed the entrance on either side, buildings standing on the wharf itself. And I hope you can see that those are these two warehouse-looking buildings right here on either side of the wharf entrance. These buildings included storehouses erected for receiving different kinds of merchandise, as described by a visitor just a few decades later. And another smaller building stands just outside the entrance, and this is a rare survival. You got this little tiny, see that little block right there? Just on the inside of that harbor wall. Keep your eye on that one. Newspaper accounts of the devastating fire of 1740 report the destruction of 4 of the city's 8 wharves. Yet still in the wake of recovery, the Governor's Council commissioned a 1743 inventory of all of the waterfront buildings for the very purpose of determining the threat from future fires. That inventory reported that Eliot's Bridge included a house, 3 large stores, another store complete with a chimney, a smith's shop, probably a blacksmith's shop, a silversmith shop adjacent to the blacksmith shop with the chimney. This is a really vibrant industrial landscape. And a 1740 notice reports that Charlestown's postmaster, Eleazar Phillips, also kept his office on Eliot's Bridge. So to house the city's postmaster would have certainly distinguished Eliot's Bridge as one of the most well-trafficked along the waterfront, attracting those elite and literate citizens who engaged in transatlantic correspondence for both social and commercial purposes. And the small building just beyond the harbor wall was a popular beer cellar. operated by one Samuel Holmes, who advertised good Chester cheese to complement stout, pale, and strong brown beer at all times. Now, worthy of note, he offered his consumables, this is a quote, for sea or land by wholesale or retail, indicating his willingness to sell both to sailors, just arriving, locals in search of stock for their own private cellars, and captains provisioning their ships, preparing for departure, right? This is an incredibly important location. And these 8 wharves were also host to the arrival of ships completing the Middle Passage. The Voyages database records scores of slaver ships arriving in the port of Charlestown through the first half of the 18th century. An average of 93 ships arrived every year in the 1730s alone. By the late 1730s, Charlestown merchants were purchasing an average of 2,600 enslaved Africans every year. So many, in fact, that enslaved Africans would comprise half of Charlestown's population by 1750. Half of the population are enslaved Africans. But given the seasonal weather patterns of the Atlantic, the vast majority of those ships docked between May and October, with the heaviest traffic, just under half of those ships, arriving in the summer months of June, July, and August. Given that the captain of any slaver ship would remain in port for at least a month, first to sell off the enslaved captive Africans, but then also to restock with export goods and supplies for the next leg of the journey, one could count on a slaver ship being in port on almost any one day throughout the summer months. Some portion of those were surely docked at Elliott's Bridge. Famous for their stench and surely animated by the cries of the as yet unsold, these ships left a distinctive mark on the human experience of these wharf spaces. Now, imagine then the activity of this commercial and residential alley at the head of the wharf, from the city's postmaster to metalsmiths and shopkeepers, offering a wide range of utilitarian and fine goods. This space, built for this purpose by the Elliott family, strategically capitalized on the proximity to sailors and their captains, but also built on an explicit connection between the commercial activities of the wharf and those of the city. And the numerous canoes and smaller boats lashed under the wooden decking indicate that many locals traveled to Elliott's Bridge from more rural settings by water, complicating the flow of goods and people as by land and by water simultaneously. As described by the Governor Glenn in 1751, Cooper River appears sometimes a kind of floating market, and we have numbers of canoes, boats, and petugas that ply incessantly, bringing the country produce to town and returning with such necessaries as are wanted by planters. In sum, Elliott's Bridge was a buzz of activity by day, enlivened by the rhythmic hammering of metalsmiths, the haggling over prices with shopkeepers, to say nothing of the unlading of crates of imported luxury goods, many of the British luxury goods that we see coming into Charleston in this period. The rolling of hogsheads of rice in the other direction, and then the groans and wails of recently imported enslaved Africans, heightened only by the yelling and violence associated with deck top or deck front sales of lots of Africans. For those Africans who survived the Middle Passage, this dock was their first sight of America. For the many seamen docked for a brief season in Charlestown, these shops would be the first they would encounter. And for many captains, these were essential sources for pre-departure provisioning. And for the residents of the city, this was a dynamic nexus of essential economic activity. Elliott's Bridge was a far cry from the quaint lane of North Adgers that we encounter today. Elliott's Bridge was a critical hub in the infrastructures of maritime commerce, but it was also the front edge of an impressive array of buildings and spaces built out by the Elliott family in the early 18th century, spaces that helped to ensure their stature as among the city's more prominent mercantile families. The bridge was first built by Thomas Elliott, a prominent member of the city's early elite, serving as a member of the Colonial Assembly in 1696, and then serving on the Governor's Council by 1720. His first wife, Mary Gibbs, was the daughter of an early colonial governor. Through the 1730s, the wharf was managed by Joseph Elliott, third son of said Thomas, but Joseph's death in 1739 meant oversight transferred to his brother William. So this is very much a family affair. Almost directly opposite the wharf and overlooking Bay Street stood a 3-story brick house. And that's this house right here that I want to highlight, okay? Which would be positioned right about there. A 3-story brick house, one of the largest buildings depicted in the Roberts View of 1739. Clearly intended as a double residence, with prominent stairs rising to either side of a central arched passage that gave access to this rear yard, this double house was almost certainly the primary residence of the Elliott family. Actually, that's not true. I've just discovered in the records yesterday that they're renting this out and it's a tenanted space. Their principal residence is elsewhere, so I should strike that from this. But it's hot off the press. These houses of the major merchant families fronting Bay Street were described as standing upon much higher ground than their warehouses. Remember that they also owned the bridge and, of course, all the warehouses and the silversmith shops and all those other activities. Those were all owned by the Elliott family. And there's this description of these houses as standing on higher ground overlooking these warehouses. They look over them from one pair of stairs, by which they mean that they command a fine prospect of the ships at the bay end of the open sea, and the open sea without the bar, meaning beyond the bar, besides a perpetual moving scene, the perpetual moving scene of what is doing at the wharves and in the street below, which is the principal part of the town for carrying on most kinds of business. And I'm also really interested in how high was the seawall, so you actually had to be in the second floor residences of these houses to be able to see over the seawall, over those warehouses, and actually have a waterfront view. And of course, it would be William's grandson, Barnard Elliott, who would commission the famous portrait pair from Jeremiah Theus, which you, I think, will be seeing later. But the wharf and the house were part of a much more sophisticated investment in real estate strategy. The house stood adjacent to an alley. So you can see there's a house here. See this little alley that kind of projects back from there? And that alley is here. And I'm also going to be talking about this alley, which is located right there in a moment. But this smaller alley immediately adjacent to the Elliott's tenements is now erased from the city's grid. It no longer survives. But yet it is represented in the 1739 iconography. It was then called Middle Alley, but the South Carolina Gazette entries and ads often name it just Elliott's Alley. Just to the north, extending from Bay Street to Church Street, was Middle Street. But again, in the passages and the ads of the South Carolina Gazette, everyday people in Charleston often call this Elliott's Street, the name that it still bears to this day. Not part of the original city grid, Elliott's Alley, marked here in the light blue arrows, appears to have been a commercial alley carved by the Elliott family out of their own privately owned parcel of land that stretched from Bay Street back to Middle Lane. The South Carolina Gazette advertisement suggests that this alley was in many ways an extension of the buildings at the head of Elliott's Bridge. Most of the items on offer were either consumables or lower-end goods intended again for maritime provisioning. So you have English red herring, for example, offered for sale either by barrel or by retail. Salt pork, also another great source of shipboard protein, was available for sale in the same alley. Shops also sold limes and oranges, and I'm overwhelmed by the number of orange groves that are spread throughout the city. Why so many orange groves? Why so many orange groves? Because orange was an important source of vitamin C, which helped to reduce the ever-present threat of scurvy on ships, right? So even these orange groves are a participant in this mercantile transatlantic economy. But the ships on Elliott's Alley offered also wine, rum, sugar, and molasses. One of the shops in the alley was a ready source of low-cost stone and earthenware. The alley also included one rentable tenement. Elliott Street, wider to the north of the alley, and here marked by the light green arrow, was a public street intended from the beginning as part of the city's grid plan. Elliott Street offered access to finer goods and likely targeted Charleston's residents. Shops on this street offered luxury imported apparel, including velvet caps and hoods, lace and linen, parcels of other European goods. But also for sale were delectable consumables like ham, cheese, butter, chocolates, double refined sugar, coffee, and aged port wine were available both by bottle or hogshead. Hugh Evans, a tailor, and Mr. Potail, a baker, and an unnamed confectioner were also in residence on the city, as were residents in the various brick tenements. At least one of them also owned by an Elliott brother. Interestingly, neither the alley nor the street is named Elliott's in the formal mapping of the city, but the South Carolina ads make clear that that's the familiar, the common names for these spaces. Now, the Othniel Beale houses and the adjacent gable-capped building are remarkable survivals of the Bay Street merchant houses built immediately after the fire of 1740, and they were likely among the grandest. In response to a 1751 request from the Lords Commissioners for Trade, the then Governor James Glenn wrote a lengthy account of the colony's exports, land values, and extensive descriptions of everything from cattle farming to taxation strategies for land. About halfway through his report, however, Governor Glenn turns to the value of houses inside and outside the city. Not surprisingly, he began with an extensive accounting of all of the houses along Bay Street, consisting of what he, quote, a single row of houses upon the Cooper River of about a half-mile in length, containing 100 total houses. In an attempt to assess the value of these 100 houses, Governor Glenn produces a table recording the trade or professions of the residents of every single one of those buildings in 1751, noting their worth and documenting their annual rentable value. Now, this table by Glenn offers a remarkable window into the socioeconomic landscape represented by these Bay Street houses. While the row included 3 widows and several residents of professional classes, most of the buildings are merchants' houses, not surprisingly, and other buildings associated with waterfront trade. Glenn lists 49 merchants living along those 100 houses along the waterfront. The most valuable series of the houses in the assessment, however, were those merchants' houses rebuilt after the fire, houses presumably rebuilt by merchants specifically to capitalize on the rapidly expanding Atlantic and global mercantile market. In fact, there is in Governor Glenn's valuation only one house valued at £900 per annum, and that house is Othniel Beale's, the pink one in the middle, the largest house along the entire row. Now, if the Elliott family townhouse and the slightly later buildings of Othniel Beale are indicative of the best early 18th century townhouses built in Charleston, there's another building type that appears with great frequency in the advertises of the South Carolina Gazette, but they've received very little attention in the scholarly literature, and these are tenements. While our more modern imagination surfaces images of late 19th century New York tenements, unsanitary, small spaces packed with recently arrived immigrants, advertises in the South Carolina Gazette tell a very, very different kind of story. In the September of 1740, for example, just weeks after the outbreak of the fire, John Martini offered a tenement containing 8 rooms with 5 fireplaces, together with a good storehouse, kitchen, and garden. Now, most of these advertisements capitalize on the abundance of available storage space, and this is another feature I'm kind of trying to dig into. In that same advertisement, Martini offers a small tenement with 3 storehouses and 2 good rooms over the storehouses. I'm coming to realize that Charleston's early 18th century landscape is littered with these buildings in backyards and rear lots called storehouses, which we would today call warehouses, right? And so this whole district is filled with houses where merchants and tenements are warehousing enormous volumes of imported goods and rice being prepared for export because there's not enough accommodation along the wharves. There's not enough warehousing along the wharves themselves. And so the private market steps in to solve that particular problem. Now, standing at the intersection of Bay Street and Broad was one famous Sindry's Row built by William Rhett between 1708 and 1711. And you see that building right here. And you've got this really awful bank building on that same location today. The 2.5-story brick building roofed with imported slate included 4 vertical tenements, shops on the ground floor, and residential chambers above. The row was only about 20 feet deep, which means it was probably only a single chamber deep. The house on the corner of Broad and Bay, obscured in the Roberts view, appears to have been the best in that row, complete with its own balcony. It became the primary residence of Sindry's eldest son. But the entire row was certainly of very good quality, as indicated by the installation of sash windows, which were popular in London just 1 decade prior. So the shop elevations show a central door flanked by windows on either side, suggesting that this Sindry's Row, what became a row of 5 vertical tenements, became a model for tenement construction. The real estate market, the rental market is so robust that merchants are simply building rows of tenement houses for accommodating the vast numbers of individuals that are coming through coming through the city. Sentry's Row is not the only example of its kind. In 1735, James Crockett advertised for sale half of a lot on Charleston Bay, right near the lower water mark. And the buildings on the alley included, again, a large storehouse. That lot, which he imagined to be an essential infrastructure, included a large storehouse to import and export goods, as well as his new bridge. And so James Crockett here has purchased this lot, will eventually build a row of buildings, and also is tapping into this expanding dependence for the massive expansion of this mercantile market. By the time Roberts undertakes his representation of the city, you can see that that is right here. So this is Jane Crockett's tenement row. Yet again, another row of 5 vertical tenements accommodating the huge numbers of individuals coming in inside and outside of the city. One door, so each of these vertical tenements, and you can see a detail down here, has a central door. Actually, it has 2 doors on each of the units. One door gives access to the store. Once again, these ground floors are just littered constantly with stores. This is a massive shopping district where everybody has access to the consumables recently imported from London. One door gives access to the store for the commercial space, and the second adjacent door gives access to a small staircase to the residential spaces for the shopkeeper upstairs. The better chambers of the second floor are illuminated by 2 windows, and you can see across the front there's this shed. There's this shed roof building with vertical posts, something that would eventually become, in the later 18th century, called what? A piazza, right? And so here we have the sort of early commercial origins of sheltered spaces that would eventually, by the later 18th century, come to be called piazzas. There we go. So, in conclusion, let us remember that the townhouses and tenements of early 18th century Charleston tell a less well-understood architectural history, that of the mercantile world that tied Charleston to the booming Atlantic economy. Newspaper accounts of the 1740 fire are among the clearest articulations of the city's mercantile wealth. They express a deep dismay that the fires struck that part of the city between Broad Street and Granville's Bastion, which is exactly the district I've been talking about, since those blocks included, quote, the most valuable part of the town on account of the trade. While we generally think of Charleston's wealth as rooted in the slave-based rice economy, we often forget the ways that the city's and the colony's first half-century was more dependent also on the extraordinary wealth of the city's mercantile class, many of whom would transition in the next generation into the ranks of the colony's largest planters. And in fact, that's what we see with the Elliots, right? They have this commercial infrastructure, and then by the 1730s and 1740s, they're also buying up huge tracts of land and would become major rice planters. But prior to the 1750s, and especially in the 1730s, Charleston was an unmatched Atlantic entrepot, the most important destination in North America along the Middle Passage. Charleston was the largest importer of enslaved Africans anywhere else on the mainland, and was also the most frequented stop of the highly trafficked route from the Caribbean to the middle and northern colonies, especially the port cities of Philadelphia, New York, Newport, and Boston. Charleston was quite literally an Atlantic emporium, and my continued investigation of the architecture and landscapes of these merchants will bring to light this understudied dimension of Charleston's early architectural history. Thank you.